When we hear the word deficit, it can sound worrying. A government deficit becomes a financial surplus. When the government spends more than it taxes away from us, it makes a financial contribution. The question is, for whom? And what are those deficits being used to accomplish?
A deficit is not a bug of the system, it's a feature. When you do the mathematics using double entry bookkeeping, you find that a government deficit creates money. The exact opposite of what textbooks teach.
Hello again, this is Richard Murphy, and I've got a special guest with me today, Steve Keen, back with us for a second time. Our first podcast together, if anything, left more questions to answer than questions answered. And so I wanted to talk to Steve again, and I've got three themes I really want to tackle this time. The first is, why is he a late convert to double entry? Second, what does he think that means for economics? And thirdly, why has that led to the development of his software program, Ravel, in which I know he has great faith and pride, and I think justifiably so. So, Steve, great to see you again. Welcome back.
Yep.
We had a great conversation last time. Let's go again. Why are you, to ask my first question, why are you a late convert to double entry?
Fascinating background. For a start, I did an arts law degree at university. So when I did my degree, if I'd done a strict economics degree, I would have had to do a year of accounting. And I didn't. So I didn't learn anything about it. And I thought accounting was boring. And I'll give you a little tale about that. You'll appreciate in a moment, mate. So I didn't learn it at university. But then when I built my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, which I did back in 1992, it was published in 95, but I built the model in August of 1992. What I had brought into that, courtesy of Minsky's argument that what causes Great Depressions is debt deflation. I had brought debt into a cyclical model of the economy. So I had debt, but I didn't explicitly have money. So economics, they liked my work. They liked my paper on Minsky, so they invited me to some conferences, and I met them at those conferences. And what Graziani did in 1989, I think, is write a paper for the journal called Thames Papers in Political Economy. And what Graziani did in 1989, I think, is write a paper for the journal called Thames Papers in Political Economy, and he did from a first principles argument. What is a monetary economy? And his argument basically came down to three principles. You can't have a monetary economy can't be using a commodity because anybody can make a commodity. So you're still in a commodity world if you think money is a commodity. Secondly, the the money must actually be a complete closure of a transaction. So if you give somebody credit, say, I owe you, then you've still got a relationship between the two of you. When you give them money, you've got the commodity, and if anything goes wrong with the money itself, that's the seller's problem, not yours. So money must be a complete conversion. Thirdly, you said, this is in terms of the private sector now, the capacity to create money can't give seigniorage rights to the creator, which means banks can't just print money and go shopping with it. Okay, they've got to earn that money themselves. So he said the only way to make this work is that money must be the promises of a third agent. There must be, in every transaction, you're going to have a buyer who has money, a seller who has a commodity, and a bank that transfers the money from the buyer to the seller. So what you got out of that was a vision of money as a triangular transaction involving three parties and one commodity. Whereas the neoclassical vision of what goes on in trade is two parties each with two commodities, and they're trying to work out a relative price.
Yes.
Okay, so that was a complete. So that was great. Yeah, so that was the start. Then I spent some time. When I wrote Debunking Economics, I began writing. Well, I began in Sydney, but I finished most of it on a sabbatical, the fabulous sabbatical at the Levy Institute in upstate New York, where I was sitting in Hyman Minsky's office next to Wynne Godley. So Wynne had developed the stock
I
flow
am
consistent
jealous.
modeling approach. Oh, that
Yep.
was great. It was a fabulous. You're going to love this, mate. There's one little real sicko. The staff gave me a bottle of wine from the Ponzi. I'm not joking. The Ponzi vineyard, signed by Hyman Minsky. Okay, so
Wow.
I actually had Ponzi and abs, and I went back to Western Sydney some years later. Had to move offices, and they said, choose a, say when you can have the day for it. And I thought, oh, there'll be ages before they do anything. I came back to my office. They'd physically moved my whole office from one building to another, and they'd thrown out this old bottle of wine. Oh God! So I lost. That's my great tragedy. I no longer have a copy of Ponzi wine signed by Hyman Minsky. But anyway, Wynne had developed. He got a guy called Tom Cripps. I can't think of his first name, to build a software package for him in DOS in those days, which is how he did his stock flow consistent modeling. And I loved the idea, but I thought he was making a logical mistake to some extent. And that gave me the idea of using tables to show money creation. So I started doing that with single entry or triple entry, depending on what I was looking at, single, double, triple, it didn't matter. And that became the precursor to the Godley tables. Obviously, I named the Godley tables after Wynne for extremely good reason. I wouldn't have come up with them without his contribution. And I want to preserve the names of the great creators of non-orthodox economics. That's another reason. I initially called Ravel Minsky, and the Godley tables are still called Godley after Wynne Godley. So anyway, I was doing single, double, and treble entry. And then I read in both Graziani and Minsky, they both argued that money is destroyed when debt is repaid.
Yep.
And my gut reaction to that was, oh, that's silly. Banks wouldn't destroy money after they've created it. So I pushed back against that with accountants at Western Sydney. And they sort of said, might be wrong, Steve. I finally realized I was wrong, because when you define money fundamentally as the deposit accounts we have at private banks, then if you pay your debt down, that reduces the money supply. So and then on the other side, it reduces your liability to the bank, your debt falls. But it was true. I was wrong about that particular point. And I then realized how important double entry was. So as we developed Ravel over time, initially we enabled double and single and any entries as you like. Then finally, we realized that to make the accounting correct, to make sure that every transaction is accurately recorded, we have to obey what I call, and you might give me a different name for it, the fundamental rule of accounting, and that it's assets minus liability equals equity. And then you can reorganize that to say assets minus liability minus equity equals zero. And that's your logical check to make sure that everything is done properly. And this is easier, I think, to understand than the debits and credits rule that came out of Pacchioli initially when double entry bookkeeping was invented. So I suddenly found how powerful double entry is, because not only does it explain money, so I've got debt on one side and I've got money on the other, and now I've got an integrated explanation that I didn't have when I first developed my model of Minsky. But it also turns up that it's a prohibition. There's some things that you cannot get to work with double entry. And one of them, for example, is the money multiplier model. Now, this is what economists teach students as being how money is created. And they argue that people deposit money in a bank, that increases the reserves of the bank, and the bank then lends those reserves out over time, hanging on to a fraction. And that's the theory that they have to create how money is created. When you do the double entry, the only way that model works is if all loans are in cash. They don't realize this yet. And
I've done that double entry, Steve. I published something on it fairly recently. But even in cash, I don't think it works. And I spent
it
a
does
long time.
mathematically.
Well, I've tried it
I
in
can
double
show.
entry terms. I can't make it work in cash. And
I can.
the
I
only
can.
way the only way I can make it work is if the bank is effectively not a bank, but a peer review exchanger of obligations. So it is, in other words, arranging loan relationships between otherwise unrelated third parties. Now, you could call cash the intermediate in that process, I suppose. I personally think
Yeah.
that actually when somebody deposits cash in a bank, it becomes the bank's property. And therefore, actually, you can't even argue what you're doing. But well, yeah, we'll have to disagree on that one. This is one of the things we can explore. That's the
Well,
reason
no,
for
no, I
having
can
this
disagree, or
conversation.
can I show you why you're wrong? Yeah. It depends what you want of you. Can I show you
No,
why
let's
you're wrong?
let's have that conversation separately. We'll come back to it, Steve. Let's keep going.
Okay, okay,
If
okay,
we've got a point of
okay.
disagreement,
Yeah, so
that's great. But that's actually gives us an
yeah,
opportunity to
okay.
discuss it again at some other time. Otherwise, though, you're absolutely right. I mean, and let's be clear about it. Banks hardly handle cash these days. And in fact, when I look at
I
this, I
don't.
just say,
Yeah,
let's ignore cash. It just doesn't really exist in the real world economy anymore.
exactly. It's a
It's a
tiny
tiny
fraction of the
part.
total money supply.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
only in America is it a major fraction because Americans still use those crazy notes and bloody coins they've had for 200 years.
yeah,
It's quite,
crazy.
or 150. It's ridiculous how bad the American monetary system is on that front.
Yeah.
Quarters. I remember one time I was in Atlanta. This is before mobile phones, and I wanted to ring a friend of mine in Atlanta. Oh, no, I was in a neighboring state. He was in
Mhm.
Atlanta, and I was maybe I forgot Kentucky, whatever it was. So I didn't call from the airport, and then I dialed the number, and then I got the comment back on the telephone lines. Please enter $6.45 in quarters. You've
What?
got to be kidding! Yes, yes, that was to make a phone call. I had to put in
Forever.
six. I think it was something of that nature. Yeah, just $6.50 in quarters. Why do they got bloody dollar coins? It's just this ridiculous primitive
Yeah.
nature of the American monetary system. So they take cash seriously, but fundamentally, when you look around the rest of the world, almost all exchanges are electronic these days. And if
Yeah.
you
We've
have
got
a
over
theory
it.
of money creation, which requires that loans are in cash, then you've got a theory which since the 19th century. That's a long explanation of where my double entry bookkeeping came from, but it's gone from something I ignored to something I'm obsessed with.
Can I just put another hypothesis to you? Because I get all of that. And obviously,
Mhm.
I mean, I've told you before, I've done double entry for 50 years. Um,
Yeah,
it's just like written inside my core. It's my second language, if you like, more than anything
yeah,
else, more than maths is, more than even English is on some occasions. But for
yeah,
me, the merit of double entry in economics, and let's move to here next, is that it demands that we presume that there is another side to the entry. In other words,
yeah,
it
that's right.
changes the mindset. We can't
Mm,
look at this transaction and say it exists in isolation. We have to think about the consequence of this transaction. And I
yeah,
think that's, for many economists, quite a revelation. I mean, even revolutionary, because that's not how they very clearly think. And it's true of many politicians. I mean, one of my great frustrations was always those politicians who used to say, well, government spending is like pouring money into a black hole. No, it isn't, because actually
yeah.
somebody
Money doesn't go
gets
down a
it,
black
guys.
hole.
There is
But
another
there's a
side.
recipient of the money at the other end. Yeah,
Yeah, there's no black hole. There's actually a person who gets it and spends it and gets it and spends it and gets it and spends it, and multiplier effects, genuine multiplier effects. But they didn't get any of that because they never thought there was another side of the entry. Now that's to me what the economic consequence of double entry is. But what's it to you? You've looked at it in a different way from me.
fundamentally the same because basically the neoclassical economists hit their chests and say we do general equilibrium. I
Yeah,
say no, you don't. Equilibrium for itself is not general. Okay, but you do need a general system. The idea that you want to have an integrated view of how the whole system operates is absolutely critical. They've just gone about it the wrong way. In that sense, when you have double entry, what you're doing is you're looking at the feedbacks. You're looking at if it goes somewhere, where does it go to? Okay? If X
yeah,
increases, what else increases to balance it? And all these things, that's what gives you the general. That's the integration. So part of having an integrated view of the economy and not having black holes in your bloody mind as well as in your model, then you have to have double entry as part of that. And that's what Ravel now, I call it Ravel or versus Ravel. I should actually get used to calling the program Ravel and the objects we use for data analysis Ravels, which are a component of Ravel. But yeah, the double entry bookkeeping is critical to having an integrated view of how a monetary economy works.
yeah. I think it has to be. It does give rise to all sorts of other questions. I'm going to hint at them, and we may want to come back and discuss these. But I have now got an idea that money is both a particle and a flow. In other words, there's a quantum element to this as well, which is actually really interesting when it comes to actually how do you record it? Because obviously we think of it as something that can flow, and yet inside the double entry bookkeeping system, it is in effect static. I mean, I always love it that people claim that Bitcoin and the ledger systems that go with it are all new somehow. But actually, money's only ever existed in a ledger, in effect. Most of our world of money is just an entry in a ledger. It's nothing more. And actually, what you're now producing with your model is what I would call, you just used the word general equilibrium, but actually, in the States, the book that is theoretically a book, of course, now a computer system that records all the transactions of an entity is the general ledger. And it is the general ledger that we are actually looking at. And it's this inability to look at that general ledger and understand all the consequences of transactions, which economists have forgotten, in particular because general equilibrium models didn't have money in them. I mean, that's
they're totally devoid of money. This is the thing. People think economists are experts on money, but in fact, all their models, not all their models, but the models that they actually apply, the ones they use for macroeconomics, what they call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, do not have money in them. There's only one economist, one neoclassical economist, that's ever included money in his models, money in banking, and that's Michael Kumhof, who's another critic of the mainstream, but within it, he's the chief economist for the Bank of England. And Michael, he actually worked as a banker before he became an economist. He knows he created money, and he wanted his economic theory to reflect that. And he's then copped the same ostracism within neoclassical economics that even I've copped from outside it, because they just don't want to know that money is significant. But to me, it's not general economics that matters, it's general dynamics. And having the double entry is a fundamental part of getting the dynamics of money correct. And the neoclassicals don't even have banks or debt or money in their model. They're not even on first base.
Well, this is why I actually do have this distinction in my mind, which I'm exploring. I'm doing no more than exploring it at present, is this distinction between money as a record of transactions, which is double entry, which is really cool, and we have to think about. But money is a flow, a quantum flow even, something which changes when we observe it. Because it does change when we observe it. The consequences change. If you think about anything, if you measure anything, you change what you've actually looked at. And there is this sort of dynamic that you've just said. The dynamic is that once we've recorded it, by the very process of recording, we have changed the nature of what we've done because we've established new relationships as a consequence of the first. And that to me is why this area of thinking is so exciting. I mean, I genuinely think exciting. I mean, again, this puts me in the category. In our last podcast, I accused you of being the geek and the nerd. I've just firmly put myself in that category. You're allowed to call me one.
Oh, yeah, well, truly.
I am. So, yeah. Look, where this then led you, though, and I want to sort of spend perhaps the rest of this podcast talking about it, because you've mentioned it, you've talked about it. Your software is something which is quite really unlike anything else I've seen somebody try to do. I mean, as an economist, I can clearly, or as an accountant, I can clearly read it. I can see what you're trying to do. I understand how it works. I suspect the vast majority of economists who simply aren't versed in accounting. I mean, they might have done that 1-year undergraduate course that you mentioned that many do.
That's probably been abolished in recent years. I
Well,
imagine they
yeah,
don't do
probably
any
have.
accounting at all.
But if they've done that, that's as far as they've gone with double entry, and they aren't therefore inherently acquainted with it as language in the way that I would say I am. So they're going to find what you're doing intensely difficult to understand because they don't see that a transaction has a consequence and they have to consider it. But you are internalizing the external in a sense by looking at the transactions in this way and coming up with this really dynamic system which you produce some extraordinary outcomes from. Tell us just in principle, let's not put anything on the screen this time, we might have another session when we do that, but let's just talk about what you're trying to do with this and how you're trying to model the world in a different way as a result, and how this is pushing the boundaries of heterodox economics, I think, in a way that is really, again, quite exciting to me.
Yeah, because I mean, everything I do I work in differential equations, so I'm doing models of change through time, and that's the absolutely critical difference between me and neoclassicals who think they're doing change through time, but they force an equilibrium outcome at the end, and they don't use differential equations. They normally use difference equations, which are completely inappropriate. So I've always worked in differential equations. And then when I saw Wynn's tables, they weren't differential equations. They were accounting balances. Every row and every column had to sum to zero. I remember looking at Wynn's work and thinking, I like the every row summing to zero, but I don't like every column, because what I'm looking at is the rate of change. How if you have deposits and you have loans, then when you say loans create deposits, what you're saying is the rate of change of loans equals the rate of change of deposits. So the variable, the flow that causes debt to rise, is also a flow that causes money to rise.
Yes.
And those two elements. So what I did initially, I did this long before I invented Ravel. I was trying to build models of my analysis of money that I'd built from Graziani using strict differential equations. And I could write them, but occasionally I'd make an error. I tried to put them into what's called system dynamic software, things like Venn, Sim, and Stellar. And I tried, and I'd always make a mistake. I'd have a plus sign where there should be a minus, that sort of thing. I could never get one of these bloody models to work, even though I had the tables to begin with. Then it occurred to me, I was actually in Norway doing another sabbatical with my great system dynamics friend in Norway, Trond Andresen. And I was literally leaving his house to go back to Australia. This is back in the 2000s at some stage. And I suddenly occurred, I wonder if I can use tables in the program I was using at the time, which is MathCAD, to build differential equations. And within 5 minutes, I'd written a tiny bit of code in MathCAD that took a matrix and converted into a flow statement for rates of change of various stocks. That was the genesis of Minsky. That was back in about 2002, 2003, I think.
Right.
So what Godly tables do is you define accounts. So the accounts will be things like reserves, which are the banks' accounts at the central bank, bonds, which they buy off the treasury, and loans. They've got those three assets, the predominant assets for the banks on the asset side of the ledger. Then they have deposits and they have their own equity on the other side. And so if you have, for example, reserves, the inflow to reserves is government spending minus taxation, minus bond sales, put those all together, that is telling you the rate of change of reserves is spending minus tax minus bond sales. So what Godly tables do is generate a system of differential equations. And you can have a Godly table with like 100 accounts if you wanted to get really complicated, and thousands of rows. And it will then generate a model of so long as each row sums to zero. And that's what Ravel assures that by making sure there's a plus. Well, there's an entry on each row, two entries on each row, so that assets minus liability minus equity equals zero. Otherwise, it points out you've made an error. So it does that for every transaction. And then it also lets you build the same transactions from the point of view of the buyer as well as the seller, the lender as well as the debtor, et cetera, et cetera. It guarantees that your model of the financial structure is accurate. So that's the power of it. There's no way I could write an equation in strict differential equations as fast as I can build it in Ravel. And there's no way that I could do the flowchart stuff as fast as I can do in Ravel. And also, like on occasions, I've known people like the New Economic Foundation, for example, was trying to build a model of the UK economy using Stellar. And I remember telling them, look, if you make any mistake at all in your model of the financial sector, and you then want to edit it using the flowchart methodology of standard system dynamics, you'll fail. You'll forget to say just too damn complicated. You can't unravel the damn thing. Unravel. Okay. You just give up and abandon it, which is what they did. Now, what I can do with Ravel is that I can say, here's how the neoclassicals think the model works. That's the model of loanable funds. And I can change it to the real world, which I called BOMD. That stands for Bank Originated Money and Debt. Okay. In a minute. And if I make a mistake, I can change it back again in a minute, because the double entry is so flexible for redefining what you think the flows are. So like, if, for example, in loanable funds, the myth that the neoclassicals have is that households lend to firms and government. So that means in that case, if that's the case, then the debt is not an asset of the bank, it's an asset of the household sector.
Precisely.
And I can put that, okay. Now you look at it and that's bullshit. The households don't lend, the banks do. So I can delete the debt being shown as an asset of the household, and put it as an asset of the banks, so long as I keep it as a liability of the firms that are doing the borrowing.
Yeah.
Because Minsky remembers, I've got one entry, it makes sure the second is consistent. So that means I can willy-nilly build models of the financial system, edit them, change them, and know that I'm not making any mistakes. And that's something you cannot do without double entry.
And where do you get to as a consequence?
I understand that the
what is
private
this going
sector.
to show the user? Why should people sign up to use your software? What are they going to show? I mean, I can understand that you're building these models, but what do you want to show apart from this dynamic change in the economy?
Well, the basic thing is that you get the exact opposite conclusion about what government spending does out of double entry bookkeeping than you get out of neoclassical economics.
Right.
So if you watch any YouTube video on loanable funds, and you'll watch a neoclassical say, well, since the loanable funds is a market, you know it's going to have a demand curve and a supply curve. That's a direct quote from one of these bloody videos. And then another one will say, if the government borrows money, that reduces the supply of loanable funds and increases the interest rate. That's another one. Okay.
Yep.
When you do the mathematics using double entry bookkeeping, you find that a government deficit creates money.
Of course.
It does the exact opposite of what the neoclassicals argue. So
Government
rather than saying that
create private wealth, it has to be the case.
That's right. That's right. The exact opposite of what textbooks teach. And of course, the textbooks have been swallowed by people like Rachel Reeves and Elton. Those are going to say Elton Musk. That'll do. Elon Musk. Hey, we need one more T. Let's call him Elton Musk. He's got some pretty bad music these days. But yeah, so it's the exact opposite of what textbooks teach. And the textbooks, when you look at their models, they both fall apart. Loanable funds can't explain demand deposits. Money multiplier can't explain money creation unless all loans are in cash, as I've said. So they have mythical models that are false. And yet those mythical models are stuff that people learn when they do PPE degree or Economics 101, and then they become chancellor. And they start actually damaging the social fabric when they think they're preserving it. So the main thing that I want the people to realize, this is why I'm so delighted to see Zach Polson as head of the Greens now, because he's aware of this. I'm trying to get it through to the other non-orthodox political parties that are coming up in the UK. The government actually creates money when it runs a deficit. That's how you create fiat money. A deficit is not a bug of the system, it's a feature.
Yeah.
And the neoclassical completely mistake it and see it as a bug. It's a feature, and in fact, we need more of it, not less. And we actually want to stop things which reduce government money creation, and that includes secondary bonds, sales by the banks to the non-bank financial institutions and wealthy individuals as well. So there's a huge, it completely changes what the objectives of government policy are. And that's radical but realistic, because rather than slashing the NHS, we should be funding it. Rather than making universities expensive, we should make them free and bloody hard to get into to get a degree, rather than credential mills as they've turned into. There's so many things we completely change in our public policy. And it comes down also to climate change, because the governments are going to be completely unprepared for what comes their way. And why? Because they thought they were saving for a rainy day.
Yes. So I'm going to draw us towards a conclusion. We've been speaking for nearly half an hour, and I think you've answered my 3 questions. Why do you believe in double entry? What are the consequences? Why are you building this model? But when it comes down to it, we go back to a point that we actually had in our last podcast, is why did you become a rebel? And as far as I can see, the reason why you had to reach this destination was to do what you said you couldn't put up with at the beginning of your journey, which was people who said they disagree with you but couldn't explain why. You're obviously the person who's got to work out why, and you aren't happy until you've actually proven using logic, because there's logic inside this system. It's not just maths, although of course mathematical logic is maths. Yes, I get that point. But you're using a form of logic, a form of maths, a form of accounting, and you're saying, this is what the real world does. Below what your theories are doing, you can't reproduce your theories in a model of the real world. You can only produce what the real world does in this model. And that's because the world doesn't behave as you've worked. And I think that's fundamentally important. In this post-Keynesian world that you and I are both in, what we're trying to do is look at what's actually happening outside the window behind you, the window beside me. What's going on out there? And we're not sitting in that closed environment where so many economists seem to exist, where they assume that they actually assume they are in a closed system, but a closed system which seems to exist on single entry rather than double entry. We're actually living in open systems where dynamic consequences over time occur, which is exactly what you're trying to model. And that's why I like this idea.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the neoclassicals, what they've done is they've undermined their own foundations, because if you go back and look at the original literature, and this is, I've got a ridiculous level of reading in the history of economic thought. There's only about 3 books that I haven't read that I think I should read. And when you look at what they're doing and you look at what the original neoclassicals did, they used equilibrium as a crutch. They knew that it was a distortion to say the system is in equilibrium, but they said, how else can we do a model? Because at that stage,
yes,
19th century, we didn't have computers, let alone we didn't have a lot of the mathematics that exist now to enable.
We're talking about the 1870s and 1880s here, after all, aren't we?
Exactly. So Marshall and Jevons and to some extent Volra and definitely Clark, you can find all of them saying equilibrium is a fallacy, but it's a fallacy we use until we can do proper dynamic modeling. But what then happened was they tried to prove the results of equilibrium analysis were the same as dynamic, and they failed every last time. Yeah. So what happened was ultimately equilibrium, they basically faced a choice, and this began right with Volra's general equilibrium model, which Volra took his model, or sent a version of his model to, in mathematical notation, of course, to Henri Poincaré, who's one of the world's great mathematicians of all time. He's somebody who put it at the level of Euclid and Newton and so on for his contributions. And Poincaré refused to endorse Volra's models. And then 20 years later, roughly, maybe 40 years later, mathematicians solved what's called the Perron-Frobenius theorem. And that contradicted, unintentionally, it's a collateral damage, contradicted Volra's equations. The equilibrium was unstable. Now, at that point, neoclassicals said, oh, that means prices must be a non-equilibrium phenomenon. Okay, we'll model the non-equilibrium. What they did instead was, we've got to make additional assumptions to hang on to the proof of equilibrium. So they actually ended up assuming, and they didn't turn it to the 1960s, they assumed you could change people's tastes. This is in Jorgensen in 1961 or 63. Okay, so the obsession with equilibrium stopped them progressing and realizing they had to make basically a paradigm shift. Yeah. And the beauty of the mathematical approach that I take is that I've seen all these points at which they could have had a fundamental dilemma that meant they had to shift paradigms, and what they did instead was hang on to the crutch of equilibrium. So it went from being a shorthand way to do stuff before we can build dynamic methods into a religious belief about the nature of capitalism. And
what a good point
to finish. So useless.
But what a good point to finish on, Steve. A religious belief in their model. And that is it.
Yep.
And this is when you come back to mythmatics, if that's the word you used, not mathematics.
Mythematics or mythemagics. I think the combination is mythemagic, but mythematics or mathemagics. That's what they do.
Okay. But that's what we have been dealing with, and that's what we have to tackle. And if only we can do that, we could achieve that list of things that you've talked about, which I want to work for, a better world for people. Steve, you've taken us on a journey through your thinking around this issue. That's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. We'll talk again soon, I hope, but thank you for your time today. Yep. Brilliant. Good to talk to you.
And great fun, mate, as always. Okay. 2 nerds together.
If you're like many other truth seekers and want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks, you'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to apply@stevekeen.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people.